I'm optimistic because I think what's happened is a political crisis of the United States that we are seeing in this very moment is going to bring forth a new set of commitments and actors to really change our country and our world to a much better place. For me, and the way I manifest what I tell other people, that's my project. That's the Borderlands Project.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening with me, your host, Chris Hayes. If you were to ask me what are the three reasons that we have the situation we have right now, which is that Donald Trump is president of the United States, which is obviously, to my mind, catastrophic. If I had to give three reasons why he's the president and why he won in 2024, it would be in this order. Inflation, number one. I think that was by far the biggest issue. Also the most difficult for an incumbent party because it doesn't have a lot of control over it. Number two was fundamentally Biden's age and the perception of his age, the fact he, dropped out, and the kind of shadow that cast. And then the third would be the border and border policy, not specifically immigration, actually, because I think actually it's worth distinguishing those two. But the perception of chaos at the border was next to inflation his strongest issue that shows up in the polls. It is still now, he's polling terribly on inflation, but when you break out in issue polling to Donald Trump, approval, his best issue to this day is the border. If you separate it from immigration. He's underwater on immigration, but if you ask the border as a separate question, he actually in recent polls has been at around 50% or par, even sometimes a little above. It's by far his best issue. Everything has come down. Immigration has come down, particularly in the wake of mass deportations, the deaths of Americans protesting ICE and people in ICE custody. His approval on inflation is massively underwater, but the border is still there. And there's one real legible through line, which is that there was a huge amount of people crossing the border under the Biden administration. It basically slowed to a trickle and ended more or less in the final 6 to 8 to 9 months of the Biden administration. And it is now, the border has been effectively shut to the kinds of crossings that were happening during the first part of the Biden administration. I think there's a lot to learn from this story, both politically and substantively. And in some ways, it's faded so far from the headlines that we can forget the salience that it once had. But I think that's a mistake. And so I'm very excited to talk to my guest today, who is, I think it's fair to say, a real expert. He has one of the most august resumes in American politics and democratic politics. Former U.S. Secretary of the Interior, the Obama administration from 2009 to 2013. He served as U.S. ambassador to Mexico during the Biden administration, 21 to 25. And he was a senator from Colorado. His name is Ken Salazar, and he's got a new book that's out called Borderlands, My Fight for an Inclusive America. Welcome, Mr. Secretary, Ambassador, Senator. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Chris. Great to be with you.
I feel like you do have a unique perspective on all this because of just where you come from and where your family comes from. If you can just tell us a little bit about the Salazar clan and and where you grew up and where your family comes from.
Oh, Chris, my family has been in the southwestern part of the United States for over 400 years. As President Obama used to say when we'd be on the campaign trail together, where he'd introduce me, he would say, in Ken's case, the border crossed them. He didn't cross the border. My family came in what is now northern New Mexico, the headwaters of the Rio Grande, Santa Fe, and then to the north, back almost 500 years ago, over 400 years ago. And so my family has been there for 250 years, part of Spain, and then part of Mexico, and then the Mexican-American War in 1848. So about 170 years as part of the United States of America. It's a history and a heritage that I'm very proud of. It's a history and heritage that has very much shaped and informed my life.
Are there things that you think, just to start out with, that people outside of that region, and particularly people like yourself, like sort of many century back Tejano folks and others, the people outside the region don't understand about that region and its dynamics and its culture and its politics?
But there's a lot. I would say that both in the United States, across the whole United States, including the Southwest. Very few people really understand the history and the dynamics and how it affects the relationship between the United States and Mexico, the United States and Mexican Americans, the border, where we are, and the future. And they're all related. They're all related. And the same is true for Mexico. Mexico and Mexicans really don't have a very clear understanding of the reality of Mexican American life in the United States. The Latinos now are about 70 million people here in the United States. That's a huge part of our population. And part of what I try to do with Borderlands, my fight for an inclusive America, is to make sure that at the end of the day, people are better understanding this history, the current relationship that we have, and also the positive future that we have if we can figure out a way of working together as a North American alliance.
One of the things, and you talk about this a little bit in the book, that I think people don't really understand, is how, you talk about the we didn't cross the border crossed us, and how the Mexican American War obviously redrew those boundaries. But how permeable that border has been for much of its history, how porous and open it was for very long, and how different it is now, just as an institution, physically, legally, than it was in, say, 1965 even.
So the 170 plus year history of the border is one of neglect. No one has really paid attention to it, on either side. A lot, very gravely on the Mexican side, and the same is true for the United States. It was a border born of conquest, and as a result of the war, the reality of our border has been shaped by a hodgepodge set of initiatives, none of which really have created a very good and modern border. That's why when Trump says that the border is broken, he's right. It's a border that has been broken for a very long time because of the inattention on both sides. And we tried vitally in the Biden administration, with me as ambassador, we tried to fix that border. Unfortunately, we didn't have the right attention from Washington, D.C. to get the job done. But we gotta get it done. And the way we're going to get it done is by having the leaders of the United States and Mexico and the people on both sides of the border really understand the importance of how this border can bring us together.
What is your understanding of the truth of the phrase "the border is broken"? What's that mean?
The border is broken in a lot of ways, Chris. Number one, it's broken because of the humanitarian crisis that it creates. When you think about migrants that are dying on the migrant trail up from the Darien Gap across Central America through Mexico, it's a reflection of a border that is broken. When you speak about the fentanyl and drugs that flow across the border that are killing now 100,000 Americans a year, the border is broken. When you think about guns, and a lot of them, that basically assault weapons, military-style weapons, that go across the border from the United States to Mexico to fuel the cartel violence, that's a broken border. And when you think about vehicles, trucks that carry the commerce between Mexico and the United States, our largest trading partner, and you think about them being in line for 4, 5, 6 hours at all of these port of entries, at over 20 port of entries in Mexico, polluting our environment, wasting fuel, and not being efficient for cross-border trade, the border is broken. So you can go on. I could describe it more and more, but that's why it needs a kind of attention that I call for as an urgent call for action in my book, The Borderlands.
Well, let's stay on this for a second, because I think that in a lot of different circumstances, there's a trade-off between what we might call, let's say, security and convenience. So, if you triple lock your house with 3 different keys, it's more secure. But to go in and out, you now got to take out 3 different keys. We encounter this all the time in cybersecurity, which has become more and more walled off, right? Everything now is 2-factor authentication, and you're constantly managing. Someone has to send you a code, or you have to log in from your phone to get into your account, and you have to verify. And all of that exists for a reason, which is that there are insidious actors at play who want to do bad stuff, right? They want to hack your accounts. It does seem to me like there's an irresolvable tension in the border as well, just what you're describing, which is that it is going to be the vector both for lots of commerce and movement between people that we want, and also commerce and movement between people that we don't want. That's trafficking of guns, trafficking in people, fentanyl. And it seems to me like there's a trade-off there that isn't necessarily soluble. How should we think about that trade-off?
Well, borders are necessary. In my view, you can't just have open borders. Border define countries, they define sovereignty. But what we can do is modernize the border. And that means technology, it means infrastructure. And importantly, it means joint planning and requirements on both sides of the border. Right now, the systems that are in place to try to create the so-called 21st century border between the United States and Mexico are ineffective, inefficient, and there is really no joint resourcing of creating this modern border. And yet we have 2,000 miles. It'd be kind of like you had 2,000 doors in your house, Chris. So you had 2,000 doors in your house, and nobody's responsible hardly at all for coordinating it so that when you want to access it, you want to create security, you want to make sure it's as convenient as it can be, you could do it. Well, in the case of the border, because of the 170 plus years of inattention and neglect, you don't have any of that. You have some places where there are actually pilot projects that could work very well, where you actually have a joint effort on both security and on commerce. So you don't have, for example, dual inspections of produce that's coming from the south to the north or north to the south. But it will take a huge effort on the border to make it a modern border that deals with people who cross the border every day in a humane way, that respects the culture of people, and at the same time addresses the security concerns. Will it ever be perfect? No, it won't ever be perfect. Will there be some inconvenience? Think about the inconvenience, Chris. You fly a lot. You've been all over this country. I fly a lot. I used to remember very well what it used to be like before 9/11. The inconveniences now at airports are really, really difficult. But we do that because we're sacrificing for security. Is there a better way of doing it? Well, there's a lot of experimentation going on to try to make it more convenient.
So I think the airport security is a great example because I do think that's where you see the trade-off, right? Like, obviously things had to change after 9/11. It has been an enormous hassle, and it has tangible effects, right? Like the longer people waiting in line, when you're talking about trucks idling, is a dead weight loss. It's a loss of people's time. It's a loss of economic productivity. There's a certain amount of it that you have to do. But then as we've gone on, there's also been, to your point, about innovations, right? Like it has gotten better. It's gotten faster. It has.
I love Clear, for example.
Yeah. Or TSA Pre.
TSA Pre. We use that all the time. I love Global Entry. It helps us a lot. So yes, innovation that comes with time of a lot of attention placed on the security of airports and the convenience of the traveler.
But I guess one question, it's a deeper question, is like, well, what is a border for? Like, what do you want the border to be? What is it? Is it like the walls of an ancient medieval city in a feudal system? Is it a place of international exchange and encounter? Like, is it both? Like, how do you think about it?
It ought to be a place of celebration of two nations and two cultures and two communities and all the cities along this 2,000-mile border. And yet it is quite the opposite. So when I think about what the border can be, I guess I would use the example of a place, Laredo, Nuevo Laredo. Laredo on the U.S. side, Nuevo Laredo on the Mexican side. Some couple of million souls live on either side of the border. And the Mexican side, frankly, cartel controlled. It's part of that place called La Frontera Chica. A lot of violence. Even the mayor of that city doesn't even stay in her city in Nuevo Laredo because she crosses the border for further security. So is that the way it ought to be? No, hell no. It ought not to be that way. But by 2020, it's probably 2021, 22, my first visits to Nuevo Laredo, I bring the mayors and the business community together. I said, why don't we do this together? Why don't we create a new way of addressing this river? Rivers are a wonderful place. I mean, I have been a champion for conservation and rivers and river restoration all over the United States. And the same thing there on the Rio Grande. So I brought the bankers and the business community together, the mayors, and I said, why don't we define a project along this river? Let's call it the Nuevo Laredo River Project, 10 and a half miles. Let's figure out a way of making it a place that has security on both the US side and the Mexican side. That's good for our border patrol because instead of having to fish through the weeds and the garbage in the Rio Grande, it's basically a more secure place for them. It's more secure for migrants and others and commercial traffic coming across that border in a good way. So it's good, and it's good for the environment. It's good for the water resources of the Rio Grande. And so we put together a plan over several years to try to make that happen. And there was actually even some funding that came in to try to make it a reality. All that has been blown up by the alternative, which essentially is you just create a great wall. So your
Right.
question, Chris, is what does a wall look like? Well, are you going to create a great wall of China? Are you going to create the great walls of medieval Europe? Or are you going to come in and do something that we know we can do together? I think we can do it. But I think it's going to take a tremendous amount of leadership in both Washington, D.C., as well as in Mexico City, because you have to do it together.
It's interesting you say that because one of the principles I've been thinking about, and with respect to border, and as I was going through your book too, is there's this Jane Jacobs in The Death and Life of American Cities. She talks about eyes on the street, and she's talking about places where there's a lot of activity in a city tend to feel safer than the places that are barren, abandoned lots. Right? They tend to attract unsavory activity, and part of the problem. Part of the challenge of the border, it's so long and it goes through deserts that are incredibly inhospitable. But your point there about Nuevo Laredo is like a vision of security and safety on the border that is a place that people are using and encountering each other pays a safety dividend because it means that it's populated and there's like eyes on the street, as opposed to an abandoned place with a wall, essentially, which is kind of the model we're pursuing now.
I totally get it. And, when we look at even in our country, a lot of our boundaries for states and cities are really defined by rivers. And yet we have this history when, say, the city of San Antonio turned its eyes and its arms and its hearts to river and created a mecca of economic and cultural opportunity for San Antonio. I've seen it happen in Denver on the Platte River. I've seen it happen in LA, in the Los Angeles River, in St. Louis, where I went there and started an effort on the renovation of the arch at St. Louis, but also the connection of the community of St. Louis up to the Mississippi River. That should be the case with all our rivers. It isn't the case everywhere in the United States, but it should be. And the most abandoned of those places are the border rivers. So you think about the Rio Grande, it is, from any point of view, environmental, recreation point of view, it's been abandoned, and frankly, not the right attention has been given to it. You look at Big Bend National Park, 1.5 million acres on this side of the river. There's about a 2 or 3 million acre national conservation area on the Mexican side of the river. I think when President Truman declared the creation of Big Bend National Park, he said, our project will not be done until we are able to connect up the two sides of the river. Well, we tried to do some of that, and we were successful with President Obama's support at the time to actually get some things going that have helped the two communities on both sides of the river and have lifted up Big Bend National Park in a very good way. We ought to be able to take every single place on that border, all the way from San Diego and Tijuana, all the way to Brownsville and Matamoros, and we ought to be able to do the same thing. But it's going to take not only some dreamers, it's going to take a lot of action and courage on the part of both the United States and Mexico.
I've covered immigration and the border a fair amount over my career, and I've been to the border and been on both sides of it. One clear trend is that we spend more and more every year on border security. I mean, enormous. We're talking 10, 20x increases if you go back to, say, the 1980s or 90s. And it's not clear that is working. It doesn't feel to me like and obviously that is now the model in the Trump administration, is to spend more money and more resources, both on internal enforcement, but also specifically at the border. Am I right to be skeptical that all that money is paying dividends?
Well, the border is still broken today, even after the investment of all that money that you talk about. The reality of insecurity along the border cities on both sides, and the violence and insecurity on the Mexican side, that's still there, and uh, it's going to continue until we're able to create essentially a zone of security on both sides of the border. And that's going to mean doing a lot more. It's going to mean information exchange between Mexican authorities and US authorities and vice versa. It's going to mean new technology to be able to detect drugs coming north and guns going south. And there is to this day not a good way of doing that between the United States and Mexico. I pushed hard for it. And part of what I say in Borderlands, again, Chris, what I say in here and the conclusions of this book about the urgency of a new North American alliance. JFK had it right when he talked about the alliance for the Americas. But we in this North American continent, with the United States and Canada and Mexico, are 500 million souls who reside on that continent, have the opportunity to do it and to get our borders right. But you're not going to do it essentially by building a great wall and demonizing Mexicans and migrants and calling people who are different essentially less than human, which is what's happening today with the language coming out of this White House and the agencies.
You had a unique view on what came to be known as the border crisis, which was a post-COVID, an enormous uptick in people presenting at the southern border to border agents, either at ports of entry or in between ports of entry, depending, seeking asylum under U.S. and international law. These were not. It's different than other forms of migration in which people were, sneaking over the border at night or traveling through the river with coyotes. This was specifically people seeking asylum, presenting, but it was also partly, I think, because there had been this shutdown of the border during COVID, and because COVID created this kind of pent-up demand in a lot of things. People going to concerts, people flying, taking vacations. There's all kinds of stuff. When COVID lifted, it was like all these crowds everywhere, right? The border was a kind of version of that, but it was almost unprecedented. I mean, the numbers were really wild. There was a period where we had more souls crossing a day than the peak of Ellis Island, for instance. So from your perch as the U.S. ambassador in Mexico during that period, first of all, when someone asks you why did that happen? What was going on? What's your answer to them, for just to start with, as what the nature of the phenomenon was and what was driving it?
So there's a reality during those years. Frankly, there were a lot of returns of migrants who reached the border or being returned back to their country. In fact, the numbers, when you look at them, are in the millions. But there was also the crashing of the asylum system and the opportunity for the courts, for Border Patrol, for everyone else to do the processing. So when you have migrants arriving at the numbers they were arriving, some of them refugees, at places like Del Rio, where there were at one time when I was there were some 15,000 people, mostly from Haiti, who were camped under a bridge and trying to seek asylum here in the United States. So what was going on essentially is that our asylum system is broken. And so what I had pushed for, what we proposed, is that we actually do some labor and migrant processing centers. So if you were, for example, in Guatemala, one of the chapters that I write about in the book is death from the Guatemalan border, which I saw firsthand in many different ways. What I was proposing that in Guatemala, Guatemalan highlands and different places, that we have migrant and labor processing centers. And we would do that jointly. So if someone wanted to get an H-2A visa, which there are a lot of Guatemalans that come to the U.S. to work in the farms and ranches, other kinds of visas, they would go there to try to come to the U.S. legally. If somebody really wanted to claim refugee status and seek asylum, they could also begin their process there. the contrary happened. And as I say in the book, in the chapter on the death from the Guatemalan border, I saw exactly what happened. You had two ways of moving forward. If you were a person trying to escape poverty, trying to escape persecution in your country, you could take the unlawful route, which is basically a criminal enterprise on the part of the cartels and corrupt officials who were involved in that, and pay, as Vanessa and Damien did, as I describe in my book, $15,000. These people are poor, and they're paying $15,000 to these criminal enterprises to be able to get transported all the way across to touch the border of the United States. So the other pathway, which I spoke about ad nauseum in Mexico, Washington, and the Senate, in the White House, and the State Department, was we need to create the legal pathways, and we need to make it a way. We need to make it clear that that's the alternative that you ought to take, because if you don't, you end up in the hands of the cartels. And that story that I tell of 170 some people being packed into what essentially was a trailer, a cattle kind of trailer. And I'm a rancher, so I know what it's like to pack cattle and small calves into the back of a trailer. Well, that's what these guys are doing. That day, I'm told, and I know, there were 3 tractor trailers full of human beings. That was a payload, a cargo of over, I think the calculation I made was $7.5 million. Okay, who's making the money? It's the cartels. Who is suffering? It's the migrants who are coming this way, who are trapped in this criminal enterprise and trying to get unlawfully to the U.S. border. If that doesn't tell you that it's broken, then something's wrong. And I describe that in my book because the death of the Guatemalan from the Guatemalan border tells me a couple of things, Chris. One, we need to focus on much more than the U.S.-Mexico border and the 2,000 miles. We got to focus on the South, and that's where we'll find the solutions. The other thing that it tells me is the story of Damian and Vanessa. Vanessa, a young woman, early 20s probably, and Damian, her toddler, paying that kind of money with the hope that they would see their father and husband in Wisconsin, where he'd been working on a dairy farm. Okay, how could we allow a system to be so broken that we create that kind of human suffering and tragedy? So that's why that chapter of the book, Death from the Guatemalan Border, which frankly shows the corruption and the criminality associated with our very broken system.
I want to oversimplify for a second, if you'll indulge me, of different views of the border on the kind of left and right. So sort of liberal, conservative. So the sort of liberal view, and the one that I'm inclined to hold, is basically that there's a bunch of people who are going to want to come because there are people in dire straits all over this world. America's an amazing place, something I truly believe, and they're going to want to come. And if you think of like a river that's got to flow, you can divert it in certain ways, but the force is going to be there. So you can have people coming, everyone's trying to go through the part that's asylum and coming, paying the cartels, or you can create other channels that goes. You have remote programs in all these countries. You open up legal immigration. You expand the ways that people can come legally. You increase refugee applications abroad, all these things. So that's one view. And again, I'm disposed towards it. I think the right-wing view on this is like, no, none of this bleeding heart nonsense. You just close it down and you send the message in no uncertain terms, no matter how ruthless and cruel it may seem, that you cannot come, that it is closed. And that shuts it down. And the reason I bring this up is I am not inclined to think that view is correct. But it is the case that basically in the last 6 months, the Biden administration and now in the Trump administration, they have basically stopped people presenting at the border for asylum. How should I understand that? What feels like a switch got turned after years of being told by Biden administration officials and progressive Democrats in Congress, all these folks, that there was no switch to turn off.
What it shows, Chris, again, is that asylum at the border needs to be changed. And that was part of the legislation supported by President Biden and supported by even a Republican, Langford, Senator Langford, and others. And that's what got killed by Donald Trump because he wanted the crisis to live for political benefit. It was the low hanging fruit, if you will, for him in the 2024 election as he continued his agenda on that front from 2016. So what has happened is, yes, there are many fewer migrants presenting themselves at the border. The Supreme Court just basically shut that down and allowed the administration to do what it wants. Um, we still need to have that asylum reform, and it should be a congressional change where there ought to be exceptions, it seems to me. If you are a refugee and you present yourself in the right circumstances, you ought to have an opportunity to state your claim. But what happened is that whole system that was in place for a long time was overwhelmed. And our circumstances have changed. Listen, I was in New York just a week or two ago, and my family went out to the Statue of Liberty. I was proud, and I think it was July 4th of 2009 to open up the crown of the Statue of Liberty as the Secretary of Interior. I see the hardship of these people who came through Ellis Island seeking a better way of life here in the new country, the United States of America. That still is very much going on, but instead of people coming in through the ships of New York Harbor, now they basically have found the way of coming in is essentially through the land bridge of Central America, the airports in the Caribbean and in Mexico, and then just coming up to the border. So we need to have a change so that we can create these lawful pathways that you were talking about, which you support, which I support. That's what we need to do. But that's why what we did right, and President Biden was right, in the Los Angeles Declaration, the Summit of the Americas, where the concept and the program there was that we're going to address migration regionally, Canada, Mexico, the US together with the rest of the Americas where migrants are coming to the US and other places. So that's the kind of approach that needs to be taken. But it has to be driven with highly effective leadership out of the United States and having highly effective leadership coming to the same place in both Canada and in Mexico.
Will you talk a little bit about your relationship with the Mexican government? The president during that time, Lopez Obrador, is a larger than life figure. He was a political colossus. He had run numerous times for the office of president and had come up short. He was the first kind of leftist identified president in a very long time in Mexico's history, and was able to, I think, very interestingly, buck the trend that almost every incumbent party in the whole world experienced in 2024, which was incumbent parties losing, and was able to facilitate the election of his sort of handpicked successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, who's now the president of Mexico. He clearly had figured something out politically, and was a very deft politician. Sheinbaum's polling is very high. There are a lot of people who really worry also that the kind of progressive populism, left populism represented by AMLO and his successor is beginning to eat away at some of the liberal features of the Mexican state, Mexican constitution, particularly judicial independence. So I'm curious, like, what your experience with that government was and how you think about some of those critiques.
So it is, as you stated, a very popular president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, to come in and to serve for 6 years, to leave office with a approval rating of nearly 70%. His successor, currently President Claudia Sheinbaum, with similar kinds of support numbers.
Yeah.
And so what do you account that for? First, you have to give credit to AMLO for his political skills. Great communicator. He knows how to manage the press and the agenda for the country. La Mañanera, which he was so proud of, right? An hour, sometimes a 2-hour press conference every day. That takes up the oxygen in the room and it sets the agenda for what everybody is hearing. That combined with, frankly, a tireless schedule. He was all over the country all of the time, 7 days a week. I described some of that in in borderlands, because I think it's important to know that one of the results of Morena and the AMLO presidency is he transformed Mexican politics. The days of the PRI in charge for 100 years, basically, the PRI is not a very powerful at all anymore. And then the two terms of PAN, Vicente Fox, and then Calderon, uh, they also, frankly, were not very successful presidents. And so the result of all that is that AMLO accumulated this huge amount of political power, controlling the huge majorities in the House of Representatives, and became, frankly, a supermajority in the Senate as well. And then controlling probably three-fourths of the governors of the states across Mexico. So when you amass that kind of power, um, it shows that he was a transformational figure. He called it, still is known as a movement in Mexico called La Cuatro T, the fourth transformation. So that has happened. But also, what happens when you have that kind of power and there's not the checks and balances, you end up doing things that, in my view, are not good for anybody. I mean, the reforms that he pushed through, even though many people oppose it, as you were noting, judicial reform, the election of some 7,000 judges across the country. If one of the things that we have to address for both the rule of law, for both security as well as for business certainty, it's to have stability in our courts and faith in a system of the rule of law. Well, when you're electing judges, that goes away, in my view. I expressed that very clearly and very candidly in Mexico. It's part of the reason why there was the falling out between the Mexican president and me during my last part of the tour of duty in Mexico. But yeah, it's like, I guess what I would say, Chris, power corrupts. Power corrupts, and there can be abuses there. And I'm not saying AMLO is corrupt. What I'm saying is that when you have that kind of power, you wield it to maintain your power forever, and you become indispensable. And to me, that's wrong. We see it here in this country. Yeah, I've never in my life, and I've served in all the positions you described, I've never seen a president who is basically about creating monuments for himself. I was in Washington. I was in charge of the National Mall. I went out this a few weeks ago, and I went to the Lincoln Memorial, and I looked down at the reflecting pool. I wrote the secretarial order that modernized the National Mall with landscaping and xeriscaping and hardscaping and all of that kind of thing. I mean, you see what's happening there, and then you leave the Lincoln Memorial and the reflecting pool and walk across the street, and there's the Institute for Peace. Used to be the Institute for Peace without a name. Now it's the Trump Institute for Peace. And you go up towards the Kennedy Center, and at that time, a couple of weeks ago, it still had the name Trump Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. And you get up on a hill and you look across to the Pentagon, and you can see Arlington, and you can see the Pentagon, and now it's the Department of War. I mean, Chris, I'm not happy with what's happening here, because I do see, and I describe it in my book, in the Project of Erasure, what's happening in our own country. So my own view is we, the reasonable people of America, and that includes independents and Republicans, it includes rural and urban, it includes all of us as an inclusive America. We need to change that trajectory. And that's why my book, Borderlands: Fighting for an Inclusive America, it's my fight, but it's not my fight. It's really our fight. It's what I describe in the book under the pinnacles of power in Washington, D.C. And President Obama and I working on adding the Bell Sumont House as a part of the National Mall for the recognition of what women have done in their march for voting, and Martin Luther King for the civil rights work that he did, and Harriet Tubman in New York, and Honolulu in Hawaii. Right? It's because we have to know that history, and we have to celebrate it. We have to recognize it. And what's happening now with this guy and his people is they're trying to erase all that history. And to me, that is a fundamental threat to the national security and sustainability of our democracy in the United States.
As I mentioned at the top, and as you mentioned, I mean, you really do have an incredible career and life and resume in public service. Secretary of Interior, Cabinet Secretary, very important position with enormous portfolio. I mean, it's truly almost incomprehensibly large, the Department of the Interior, both in sort of pure mileage and also the parts of the government. You were a U.S. senator.
Excuse me, Chris, it's the most important department in the United States of America.
Wait, say that again. What did you say?
It's the most important department in the United States of America. Period. It is.
Say more about that.
Well, when I went over to Interior, I was a United States senator, and President Obama, then President-elect Obama, asked me part of his team. And I remember sitting down with one of my senator heroes, Danny Inouye, and talking about whether I should take the job. Danny says to me, Ken, you got to take it because it's the most important department of all the departments in the United States. And he says, one, you're the custodian of America's natural resources. That's our national parks, our BLM lands, our oceans, our natural resource. But he said, you are the custodian of America's heritage. And the reality of it is the department has failed in that venture. So you go and take this job and I'll support you. And we can tell the story of all of America, which is why I still think what we did during the Obama years was really to tell that story in a way which now the 180-degree about face that we see going on is alarming to me, and I'm sure it is to all people who really care about understanding our history and the future of our country. Anyway, I was proud to be the Secretary of the Interior for the United States, and very proud to serve in that role with what I used to call the Obama Dream Team, because we had one hell of a team that did a whole hell of a lot to try to get our world on a trajectory that was this march to a better America.
As someone who has seen public service and U.S. government from so many different perspectives, and also has an international perspective because he was an ambassador in Mexico, and we're just describing it. Like, in terms of where you are on how bad things are, how much of a threat the current both president, the movement around him, the Republican Party that facilitates him is, 10 being like as dire as it gets, existential, the possibility of a real, genuine epochal break in the story of American democracy. I mean, truly like the end of it in some profound sense. And the other pole being like, people freak out all the time. We're going to be fine. Where are you?
I'm at about a 9. I think we are in a crisis of politics in this country. But it's not a desperate moment. So I tell people as I travel around the country and here in Colorado that you need to take action. And once you take action, from action, we spring hope. Hope is what will keep us driving. I run into lots of people as I'm at the ranch or the grocery store, people stopping by. I remember lots of people will come up to me and say, why can't we return to those days of common sense and dreaming big things for the United States? And how can we address climate? And how can we keep going the conservation movement of America, et cetera? And I tell them, you got to do what you can do. So some people means they're talking to their neighbors about their concerns. Some people are out doing the rallies, whether it's in Springfield, Illinois, or here in Colorado, through all the communities that I travel through. But they're doing something. I was with a group of leaders of the conservation climate community, and they're doing something. They're working on conservation projects. They're still with great hope about how we can harness the power of renewables and address the ravages of climate. So they're doing something. So my own sense of it is I'm optimistic because I think what's happened is a political crisis of the United States that we are seeing in this very moment is going to bring forth a new set of commitments and actors to really change our country and our world to a much better place. For me, and the way I manifest what I tell other people, that's my project. That's the Borderlands Project. This book is a tool, but it's not my project. My project is to create this durable, long-term framework for North America. And that means a lot for the 500 million people. There's a lot of pieces under that, but that's why the concluding chapters of the book are about the urgent moment. I say the urgent moment because we have to act now if we're going to save our democracy, save our planet, if we're going to understand that we live in community, that we are an inclusive America. We have to act now. And we have to reject the right-wing extremism that we see happening in the country today.
Final question for you is about, since you mentioned climate, I just asked you where you were on democracy and the sort of threat right now. We've watched this Interior Department attempt to kickstart coal, throw federal subsidies at coal, pay billions and billions of taxpayer dollars to companies to not develop wind. That would add clean, carbon-free generation to the grid, a grid that desperately needs that increased generation. I mean, they've obviously in the legislation that was passed by Congress last year, they've overturned some of the subsidies and tax credits that go to green energy. It has been a sort of full spectrum war on renewable energy, green energy, carbon-free generation, even at the moment, ironically, when that energy is now cheaper than it's ever been, in many cases, the most accessible, affordable, marginal way to add capacity to a grid that desperately needs it. So you have these two forces right now, like pulling in opposite directions. The Trump administration that basically wants to destroy carbon-free energy generation and go back to coal and oil. And the remarkable development, both at the technological and economic level, of green energy. Which of those is winning right now, as someone who knows this area of policy so well?
Well, for the moment, the Trump administration has basically done a 180-degree about phase on everything that we've been building out for a very long time. Since Jimmy Carter found the reality that we needed to become independent as a nation on energy. And since President Bush was working on the all of the above energy strategy, and then our implementation of the laws that we passed when Senator Obama and I were in the Senate, we executed those laws when we were in power. And we brought about what I called the renewable energy revolution. And it was a huge uplift for us to be able to deal with climate in a way that was very good. I remember even in the Senate, this would have been 06 or so, I write about it in the book, but President Bush comes here to Colorado. And as a senator, he invites me to go with him to the National Renewable Energy Lab. We asked the director then of the lab, how much renewable energy can we produce? Is it 5%, 10%, 20%? He says, it's what we decide to do. And so I remember the conversation with the president saying, we can get to big things. And so then President Obama comes in. Climate and energy are big things for us on both the energy independence side, but also on protecting our planet. So first secretarial order that he authorized and I wrote at Interior for me was the Renewable Energy Task Force. So that's harnessing the power of the wind and the oceans, the power of solar, the power of geothermal. And with all the new technology that's been developed with that time, we're on the cusp of really becoming a clean energy nation. And yet it is alarming to me, and it should be for everybody, that is all being being killed as we speak. And so, when I think about what ought to be the real keys to the future of our country and the United States, I say it's securing America, and that means securing a lot of its ways, but it's also saving our planet. If we don't act, the ravages that we see with the fires, the droughts, the tornado, all that we see on the oceans, in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, in the southeastern part of Mexico, here in the plains, it's appalling. So we need to do a lot more right now to save our planet. And what this administration has done internationally by walking away from the Paris Climate Accord, and what they're doing by walking away from the progress that we've made on climate and renewable energy, is just dead wrong.
Ken Salazar, served as the Secretary of the Interior. He's also a U.S. Senator and also Ambassador to Mexico. His new book is called Borderlands, My Fight for an Inclusive America. That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chris.